Welcome back to Classics 170, Beach House Edition. This lesson we begin reading Virgil's Aeneid, a work that T.S. Eliot once described as the all-time classic of Europe. And a lot of the things that we've been reading in this class so far have led us to this moment. You'll see as we read the Aeneid that it's thematically linked to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and a lot of the Greek tragedy we've read so far. So, what makes it different from the Iliad and the Odyssey and a lot of the tragedy we've read so far? In order to answer this question, it's probably best for us to explore a bit about Roman history. Most of this lecture will concern itself with a simple overview of Roman history. So let's ask ourselves a few questions. Where and when are the Romans? And this question is easy enough to answer. Let's have a look at the map, shall we? You can tell by looking at this map that the Roman Empire covered quite a large swath of land. It goes in the north all the way from what is now England, as far south as the Upper Nile at its greatest extent. In the west, it went from Spain into the east as far as what is now Iraq. And then in the north, again on this side, up around the Black Sea. So you can see this is an empire that covered an enormous amount of land in a time when there were no ways of crossing vast distances in a short amount of time. And perhaps this makes it all the more impressive. Well, when are the Romans? We'll talk more about this in a moment, but the legendary foundation date of the city of Rome is 753 BCE, and the kingdom/empire of the Romans lasted all the way until 1453 CE. That's just a few years before Columbus sailed to the New World, when the city of Constantinople fell to the Turks. So let's talk a bit about their early history. The early history of the Roman peoples begins not in the city of Rome, but in a little town called Alba Longa, not far from what would become Rome. And here's how the legend goes. The twins Romulus and Remus were born to the priestess Rhea Silvia when she was raped by Mars. After this, she put them in a basket and let them float in the Tiber River so that they wouldn't be discovered. Sound familiar? The basket washed up on the shore, and there they were discovered by a she-wolf, and later they were adopted by a shepherd and his wife. They grew up big and strong, and Romulus eventually founds the city of Rome and kills his brother Remus in the process, and this is why the city is called Rome. And hey, doesn't it sound cooler than Rheme? Within a few generations, the city of Rome falls under the occupation of kings from the north, from a place called Tuscany, and these Etruscan kings ruled for a couple of hundred years, until the year 509, when something extraordinary happened. The Romans get together and kick out the Etruscan kings, who have been ruling the city for all this time. They do so in the following way. A man named Marcus Junius Brutus, Brutus, by the way, is a funny name. In Latin it means something like stupid to the point of being mentally disabled. Brutus was silent, and people thought he was less than intelligent, so they had a way of telling him things. As it turns out, he gathered people's secrets and collected them, so when it came time to vote on who would rule the Romans after they kicked out their oppressors, the Etruscans, people were lining up to do Brutus favors. He called in all those favors and was elected first consul of the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic was organized this way. Instead of having a king, they had a senate, and the senate was a body of older men who would get together and talk about issues and decide on how they worked. It's a kind of democracy, but really an oligarchy, because it was a rule from the top. These were old, rich men, and it wasn't representative in the way the normal representative democracy is. Over time, the Roman Republic would grow to occupy all of the Italian peninsula, until by the year 100 or so, it actually occupied not only all of the Italian peninsula, but just about all of southern Europe, some of Asia Minor, and parts of North Africa. It also includes, all of what used to be Greece. And this is an interesting development, because the Romans will actually come to take on a lot of Greek culture from the Greeks around this time. By the year 100 BCE, the Roman Republic stretched all the way in the west from Spain in the east to Asia Minor, and from in the north to northern Italy as far south as North Africa. But there were problems with this expansion. One of the main ones was this. In a republic that was this large, information took a long time to travel from place to place. And frequently, the Senate in Rome had a hard time responding to the needs of people out in the provinces in time. And for this reason, amongst many others, it was around this time that a series of strong men rose up. who were able to, with the help of their armies, influence the politics of the state. Some of them were even able to raise enough money to have private armies of their own. One such strong man in this period was a man by the name of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was from an old aristocratic family in Rome that went all the way back to the origin of the city. His family had fallen on hard times, though, and he was able, through a brilliant military career, to recapture his family's fortunes. And here's how he did it. In the 50s BCE, he was given the position of governor of Gaul, in what is now France. The problem was, the Romans didn't actually possess this as part of their empire at this point. So for the next 9 years, Julius Caesar pacified Gaul. In the process, he accumulated a lot of wealth. And this allowed him to not only win the loyalty of his army, but also buy a lot of elections back in the city of Rome. Here's what the Roman Republic would look like by the time he was done with it. What's more, he also was not afraid to go far afield in order to consolidate his power. In 47, he went to Egypt, where there was a civil war going on between Queen Cleopatra and her brother. He backed Cleopatra, and according to some, had an affair with her, the result of which was an illegitimate child named Caesarion, or Little Caesar. But we'll talk more about Cleopatra in a minute. So he did a lot to add to the empire, but there were those who were disappointed with him. He had himself acclaimed dictator by the Senate. That was actually an elected position back then, 3 times. The 4th time, he had himself declared dictator for life. For some, this was just too much. This sounded a lot like kingship, and we know that the Romans don't like kings. So, on March 15th, the Ides of March, in 44 BCE, Caesar was killed by some of his best friends and as many as 50 other senators in the Forum, the central hub of business and government in the city of Rome. Well, so much for Caesar, but this is actually where our hero, a man named Octavian, enters the story. And Octavian was Caesar's great-nephew, and in Caesar's will, he posthumously adopted Octavian, his great-nephew, to be as his sole heir. What did this mean? It meant that Octavian had access to all of the money that Caesar had acquired while conquering Gaul, and it also meant that he had a lot of political connections that were passed down from Julius Caesar. Only a year after Octavian was left his uncle's fortune, he made the audacious move of purchasing an army and taking the top political office in the state of Rome by force, by occupying the Senate House. However, for an 18 or a 19-year-old to hold this much power wasn't going to work out in the long term, and he needed help to do this. So to make sure that this power would stay his, he decided to share. In the year 40 BCE, he concluded what's called the Treaty of Brundisium with 2 other men, Mark Antony and Lepidus, and they formed the so-called Second Triumvirate. In this agreement, a man named Lepidus, who was a senator who was fabulously wealthy, took control of Spain and Africa. Meanwhile, Octavian himself took Italy and much of Europe. Octavian's the one to the right in this coin. Lastly, Mark Antony, the guy to the left in this coin, would take much of the East, and that meant he had what is now the Middle East and a lot of Turkey. The last part of this deal is that Octavian's sister, Octavia, was made to marry Mark Antony against her will. And we'll see why this is important in a minute. Mark Antony would travel to the east and take control and rule from Alexandria. And there he met a certain Cleopatra. We met her earlier when she had an affair with Caesar. Well, it turned out that she also had an affair with Mark Antony, and this is going to cause some trouble between Mark Antony and Octavian. All good things come to an end, though. By 36 BCE, Octavian had decided he'd had enough of sharing power, so he forced Lepidus into retirement. Then he decided he'd had enough of Mark Antony. What was wrong with Mark Antony? Here's what was wrong with Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a drunk and unreliable, and also he was unfaithful to Octavian's sister, Octavia. He'd been having an affair with Cleopatra for quite some time, and even went so far as to have 2 children with her, while he was still married to Octavia. For most Romans, this was just too much. So Octavian began rallying the people of Rome for a war between him and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. What was his case for war? Cleopatra was royalty. The Romans don't like royalty. Remember, they kicked out their kings some time ago. She's foreign. The Romans are deeply suspicious of foreigners, especially Easterners. Also, she worshipped un-Roman gods, like Isis and Horus. In fact, on her own coinage, like this one right here, she styles herself Isis. And you can see that this is a headdress of the worship of Isis, which the Romans regarded as a foreign influence. She had 2 babies with Mark Antony while he was still married to Octavia, and this was unforgivable for the Romans. Octavian was able to successfully press for war, and in 32 BCE, the 2 armies joined battle at Actium, which is off the coast of Greece. In the naval engagement that resulted, Antony's forces were shattered. Both he and Cleopatra fled the scene of the battle and retreated back to Egypt. Antony later committed suicide, and so did Cleopatra. And Octavian celebrated the event by striking up coins. Egypt was then added as another province to the empire. By 27 BCE, Octavian finally gave up extraordinary powers that had been voted to him by the Senate, but was accorded the title Augustus, which means reverend or holy, by the Senate. And this is the title he would take for the rest of his time in office. And in fact, this is really his main title while he was in office. He was never really called emperor in the way we would think of a Roman emperor having that sort of title. However, later he took powers that individually might have been given to other people and consolidated them in one place. Now, the Romans didn't have a constitution that was written down. They relied on what were called the mos maiorum, or the tradition of the elders, for coming up with their laws and ways of doing things. None of the powers that Octavian/Augustus would accrue during this period were strictly speaking new. However, he was the first person to ever have them all at the same time. Also, he was the first person to ever have them all for life. Within a generation, the tradition of the elders had changed, because suddenly you had an entire generation of people who had grown up knowing only this one ruler who held power for life. As a result of this, Rome would never really be a republic again. He used the Senate as an administrative apparatus, but in fact, Octavian, now Augustus, was fully in charge of the state and would hold on to it all the way until his death. Augustus would enact many changes to the social landscape of the empire around this period too. Let's talk about these. He created a law called the Lex Julia in 18 BCE that made adultery a criminal offense. He brought about a law called the Lex Papia Papaya, which made it illegal for people of senatorial class to remain celibate. And what does that mean? It meant that it was impossible for you to stay divorced for more than a few years. You had to be married and thus producing children so you could create the next generation of Roman senators. And this was important for this class because during the time that Octavian grew up, a lot of the best and the brightest of the Roman Empire were killed off during a series of civil wars. And in order to repopulate the ranks of the Senate, he felt it was important for Roman senators to breed. Octavian had also grown up in a household without a father. His father had died when he was 4. And it's easy to psychologize here, but one thing we do know is he grew up without a strong male role model in his life. And so he brought back the old tradition of paterfamilias in Roman households. And this is a law whereby the father of the household is entitled to administer all family property, even of adult children, sell his own children into slavery if he sees fit, or kill members of his household without legal repercussions. While it is true that the empire expanded greatly under the rule of Octavian/Augustus, it's also true that he ushered in a great era of internal peace. When he had finished conquering all he wanted to conquer on the outside of Rome, he reached a point where he thought the Romans had had enough. And in fact, he was proud to say that he'd done the following. He had shut the gates of war no fewer than 3 times during his reign. What does that mean? In Rome, there's a temple called the Temple of Janus Geminus, and it has twin gates, and when they're shut, Rome is at peace. When they're open, Rome is at war. Most of the time, Rome had been at war during Octavian's lifetime, but he created 3 periods in Roman history during his own lifetime when the Romans were actually at peace, and this was a major thing. In the year 9 BCE, as a matter of fact, the Senate commissioned an altar, and it was a monument to the so-called Pax Augusta, or Augustan peace, that came about as a result of Augustus's rule. The Romans were no longer at war with themselves, and they weren't as frequently at war with outsiders. You can still go see the altar of peace in Rome. Stay tuned for my next lecture on Virgil and his role in Augustus's new empire.